agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a professor of political science at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, Cleveland area attorney Jay Carson.
Hey, good morning, Mike.
Hey, Jay, how you doing this morning?
Feeling 1.9 trillion less good than I did yesterday, but
Yeah, I would say just the opposite for me, but we will, and that's something we will certainly get to. Before we do, just a couple quick things. First, I want to thank everyone who responded to our campaign for a new main production computer with your really generous contributions. I tried to make sure everyone got a personal thank you message from me, but in case I missed anyone, and also I just want to thank everyone again because it was just so awesome, you guys. Thank you so much. We're really grateful for the support. And I'm pleased to say the new machine is fully funded, on order, and Dell tells me it should be here by this time next week. So very, very cool. And again, just we have such great listeners. And Jay, I don't know about you, I'm just always just amazed.
I'm flabbergasted.
Yeah, it's really great. So thank you.
I wouldn't give you money.
I also want to thank our newest contributing Patreon supporters, Tristan, Tyler, Derek, Cheryl, and Edwin. Thank you very much. And of course, when you're a Patreon supporter, you get that second full-length episode every week. You also get ad-free versions of all of our shows, as well as other stuff at different levels. To check it out, patreon.com/politicsguys. And again, always remember that if you would like all that bonus content, but you're just not in a position financially to support the show, just send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get you all set up. And as always, if a monthly pledge is too much of a commitment, that's totally understandable. You can also support the show through PayPal or Venmo now. Actually, we're at Politics Guys there, and all those links are actually in the show notes. All right, so Jay, before we talk about the first thing we're going to talk about, I wanted to talk about the first thing we're not going to talk about, at least briefly. We'll talk about it next week. That's the CPAC, Conservative Political Action Committee Conference. Kind of a big deal. It's been going on for a couple of days now. We record on Saturday mornings, and there have been the usual sort of speeches. There was Ted Cruz there saying something about, I don't even know. I can't say that I listened to Ted Cruz, but President Trump is scheduled to speak on Sunday, and I think that's definitely going to be pretty interesting because it will be his first really public appearance since the end of his presidency. And a lot of people are going to be watching that. We are too. And we will be talking about that on next week's show. So if anyone wanted to know, well, why aren't you talking about CPAC? Just hang on for a week and we will be talking about it then for sure. One other thing, I guess briefly, Jay, is I wanted to bring up Mitch.
Two other things before we talk about the first thing.
Yeah. No, I wanted to bring up Mitch McConnell. This came up late this week. On Thursday of this week, when Mitch McConnell was asked, I believe, by Fox News whether he'd support Donald Trump if he wins the 2024 Republican nomination, and he said to the effect of, if he's a nominee, absolutely. And I was sort of dumbfounded by absolutely. Because let's recall, this is the guy who less than 2 weeks before that said former President Trump's actions preceding the riot were a disgraceful dereliction of duty. There's no question that President Trump is practically and morally responsible for provoking the events of the day, with police officers bleeding and broken glass covering Capitol floors. He kept repeating election lies and praising the criminals. And so will McConnell support him if he's the nominee? Absolutely. I don't know what to make of that, Jay. Help me out here.
Well, I mean, I guess you might say it's again the triumph of hope over experience. No, I think McConnell's one. I don't think he thinks Trump will be the nominee. And I think his statements were more along the lines of, look, I'll support the Republican nominee because, look, that's what I do as at this point, the most senior elected Republican in the country. And I don't think he thinks it'll be Trump. I think he will make he may in fact take some action to make sure it isn't Trump. So I don't know. I don't read a whole lot into it. That if Trump is the nominee, Mitch McConnell is going to be out there campaigning for him. Quite honestly, you could probably envision a world where a Mitch McConnell campaigning for Trump is sort of hurts Trump, right? So.
Yeah, I guess,
Yeah.
I was thinking about the oath that all senators take, right? And they take an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And it seems to me that Mitch McConnell's oath, if he were to write his own, it would be to support and defend the Republican Party against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I mean, I'm being serious here because I understand the argument that, well, I believe that my party is a vehicle for doing good for the American public and so forth, and so therefore I try to support my party. But when you seem to believe, at least if your earlier comments are, his earlier comments are accurate, that the party's president actually, had some pretty significant issues that, would go to that, it seems to me that he's pretty explicitly saying that if push comes to shove, I will put my party before I put before the Constitution, and that's just really, I find it deplorable.
Well, I don't think he would, because I mean, we saw the, he and a number of other senators had the opportunity to do that. You can say, well, maybe he did because he voted to acquit. But I take, predictions of saying what you may or may not do a couple years down the road. I always take with a grain of salt, and I don't, I think almost there's also sort of a strategic thing, right? Is if Mitch McConnell were to come out right now and say, I will absolutely not support Trump and campaign against Donald Trump. Does that empower Trump? I think there's probably an argument that it might. So no, I guess I don't read as much into it as you do, other than him saying, well, I'll support the nominee of the party. And again, that predictions about the future were always difficult, and it's, people change their minds. So.
Okay. All right. So that, like I said, I was curious about your take on that, which I assumed would be different than my take, but I could see where you can sort of reach that conclusion. All right. So let's move on to actually the main story of this week, and that is that on Friday, the House of Representatives approved President Biden's $1.9 trillion pandemic aid bill by a vote of 219 to 212, with all but two Democrats supporting the measure and Republicans unanimous in their opposition. And this bill includes those $1,400 checks to Americans making less than $75,000 a year, although there is a sharper sort of phase out above that level than in the previous stimulus checks and a complete cutoff at $100,000. And the bill also includes a number of other pretty important provisions. And as you would expect, it's a $1.9 trillion bill. So there's a lot in there, like, for instance, extending unemployment assistance through the end of August, boosting weekly payments from the current $300 to $400, increased nutrition assistance for low-income families, a pretty big boost in the child tax credit. Right now it's $2,000, and it's going to go up for a year to $3,600 for children under 6, tripling the maximum earned income tax credit for workers without kids, $130 billion for K through 12 schools, $40 billion for higher education, increased premium subsidies for the Affordable Care Act policies, $350 billion for state and local governments, $14 billion for vaccine research, development, and distribution, $46 billion for testing and contact tracing, $7.6 billion for hiring 100,000 public health workers to support the COVID response, and maybe most controversially, that increase in the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour by 2025, as well as an end to the tipped minimum wage. And that just kind of hits some of the main things. Obviously, again, $1.9 trillion, there's a lot in there, but
there's probably a couple
things I missed. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I think those are probably the main things. But next up is the Senate, where we know that at least one of those House provisions, and that's the minimum wage increase, won't pass because the chamber's parliamentarian this week ruled that it can't be considered under reconciliation rules, which allow budget-related legislation to pass without the possibility of a filibuster. So, Jay, what do you think? I assume if you were a House Republican, you would have voted against this with every other House Republican. But what are your main objections to this?
Main objections have to do with the $350 billion to states. I think a lot of this is it's the padding, right, that we've been talking about before. That this is an opportunity to bail out some states that have issues that may be unrelated to the pandemic.
Let me just stop you right there because I was hoping you were going to say that because I actually read the legislation, not all 600, 500 something pages of it, but I was curious about that particular provision. So I read the entire section about that provision. And in that $350 billion to state and local governments, there's a specific requirement saying that they use that funding only for responding to the pandemic, covering pandemic-incurred costs or replacing revenue lost due to the pandemic. So you can't just say, well, we'd like a new fleet of whatever, I don't know, electric vehicles just because it would be cool to have or something like that. Or there's a sale that, whatever, we'll just get. And so it seems to me, I think that objection that you have is an important one and a reasonable one. And I feel like, though, in crafting the legislation, they designed it to address that specific objection, which I agree with you on, actually.
See, no, I here's the problem with that is that money is always fungible, right? And if you're getting $350 billion, I'm saying in the aggregate, your states are then able to offset other expenditures that they would have made against that $350 billion and redirect them.
But
I mean, we've done this. We've done this in states for forever, where you have we have a lottery and it goes to fund education. Well, of course it does, but what it does, it just displaces other general fund money that would have been spent in the same place and opens it up to be spent somewhere else.
Sure, but I don't see that's a problem because if all the states can only use that money for pandemic stuff, that certainly helps out every state, but it only helps them to the extent that the pandemic affected them. And so they're going to be, if you have a huge problem with whatever your pensions, your pension system, like, for instance, Illinois or Kentucky have, that doesn't really help you any more than just because this money goes toward that, you still have that problem. So it helps you in the sense that, well, you're not in as deep of a hole as you were, but that's only because of the pandemic. So I mean, yes, money's fungible, but I think it's a kind of a false argument.
Well, think about it this way. Certainly a lot of these states are going to be arguing that, hey, our tax revenues have been down because of the pandemic.
Well, yeah,
we got to replace this same money. So it's and I would say a lot of studies are showing tax revenues aren't as down as initially had been predicted. A lot of states have bounced back and actually done better than initially predicted, which is a good thing. Let's put it this way: if I said, I'm going to give you money to pay your mortgage for the next 5 years, but you can only use it for your mortgage, wouldn't that open up other savings that you could then just spend money on other stuff?
Yes, but that's not the case here. The case here is it's money designed to recompense states for money that they lost due to a specific thing. So it's just like saying, well, if someone says, a tornado blew your roof off and I'm going to give you money to replace your roof. And you're saying, well, yeah, but money's fungible. And so, that money that you use to replace your roof, you can go ahead and send the money you wouldn't have had to use out of your regular budget. You can go ahead and buy groceries with. Well, yeah, that's true. But, that's the tornado came and ripped your roof off your house. And so that's the real issue here.
Based on my experience, this is another, I guess, criticism of that approach would be, though, that, caused by the pandemic, I'm betting will be defined rather broadly by these states and not enforced terribly stringently by the federal government.
Now that's another issue, and on that, I think, yeah, I can see certainly making an argument that, well, how is this going to be enforced? And that's something that you and I might actually have a little more agreement on, because I think you're probably right that it will be done in a very sort of permissive sort of way. And I can certainly understand, especially a fiscal conservative saying, hey, let's be very careful about what we okay and what we don't. And so on that, I think on those grounds, yeah, I think you have a point there.
So another, criticism, and this sort of feeds into the first one, and I guess kind of gives you a little bit of a tip off of why the first one isn't necessarily a legit argument, is when this money is going to be spent. For example, there's, of education funds. I mean, right now, and this is based on an op-ed that Mitt Romney wrote last week, is that of the $80 billion that's already been appropriated, sent for education, $68 billion has not been spent yet. Only 4% of the money for K through 12 haven't been spent. Some of this money is not going to be spent until up through like 2027, 2028. And I think it's a tough argument to make, to say, look, this is something we absolutely need right now, immediately, to get us out of this pandemic and the problems caused because of it. But we're not actually going to be spending the money for another 5 years. We haven't spent the money that we've been given already, and we're not going to be spending the rest until much later. I think that really cuts, against the integrity of the argument of saying, well, look, this is an emergency. We need to do something right now. We need to go big. We need to turn on the fire hose, as it were. This is sort of, we need to turn on the fire hose and keep it running for 5 years. So I think that's problematic, and that indicates that, look, there are a lot of other priorities in here that aren't pandemic related. It's stuff that Democrats wanted to fund anyway, and this is a convenient vehicle for it.
Well, yeah, I think on that, it's not exactly the case that there are these hundreds of billions of dollars that school districts are saying, well, yeah, we have this money in our account. We're just putting it in big Scrooge McDuck vaults and kind of rolling around in it.
Sure.
I mean, that's not, and I think that's the impression people get when they hear that only X% of this money has been spent. There's a long and very involved process getting through the congressional appropriation of the funds to the actual, all the bureaucratic hoops that have to be jumped through.
Right. No, we talked about that a couple weeks ago.
But that's why I'm saying it's important to keep that in mind. And secondly, even if some of that money won't actually all of it get spent for a number of years into the future, if it's still related to that initial hit that's being taken because of the pandemic, I don't see where that's a problem, whether it's spent in, whether it's spent in 2022 or 2032 for that matter. And thirdly, this idea that it just kind of funds a great Democratic wish list, I would disagree with that, because in looking through the legislation, it seems to me that everything in it, or almost everything in it, is really pretty focused on COVID. Like, for instance, that $130 billion to K through 12 is, it has to be spent on getting schools back to in-person learning as soon as possible. The higher ed money has to go
toward. Let's put it this way: if we're still haven't been spending that, if we still have $68 billion in the pipeline that hasn't been spent to get places back open to normal. I mean, are we saying that we're going to need this money to get schools opened up normal 5 years from now? I mean, that's the problem. And I guess my thinking is, look, if you're spending this kind of money, and if you have so much in the pipeline that still hasn't been spent, maybe we wait to see if the additional funds are really needed. Let's wait and see what schools and other states, local governments do with the other money that is in the pipeline before we pump in more.
Okay, and that's not an unreasonable argument. I think then you have to kind of do some calculating and do some analysis about what these needs are and so forth, then reasonable people can come to different conclusions about that. It seems like, as you would now, you're going to say as you would expect, but certainly the schools and the state and local governments say no, we actually will definitely be needing this funding. And again, I know you said, well, what are they going to say? We're going to turn away the money, but yeah, I mean but I believe, I believe that that's been taken into account.
My point is, if it's an argument of, oh, we need this money in order to open up during this school year, and then they say, but we're not really going to be spending that money for another 5 years. I see what you're saying. That indicates to me that okay, well then the premise that you're giving me that this is what you need to open schools is not really true.
Well, see, to me, the way I look at it is, well, we're going to need this to open schools, and we can go ahead and do this, but we're going to be essentially borrowing against the future, and we're not going to be able to, just like, all the time, people go ahead and take on expenses that they can't necessarily afford at that time, but they know that there's an income stream coming in, and so they can go ahead and borrow against future income flow. And so that's how I look at it more. So
I don't see any evidence of schools borrowing. I guess that's the other question is, to some extent, if school districts and other governments like that are limited as to what they can borrow, how they can borrow.
Well, borrowing or cutting or moving funds from one place to the other, that sort of thing. And sometimes you have to do that to kind of meet an immediate crisis, certainly. But after that crisis is over, then you still have all these holes you need to fill.
Okay. I think I'm.
Let me ask you this: Is there anything in this you like?
I think the actual payments to individuals I like, because it's kind of like a tax cut. I've said that before. I think it is sort of the government giving people their own money back. I think it's an effective sort of stimulus as opposed to getting rejiggering the tax code or something like that. You're actually giving taxpayers back their own money. Now there's certainly a redistributionist element to it. There's also the idea that, look, that money is most likely going to get spent more quickly. And again, that's sort of a strange thing, right? If you send somebody a check for $1,400, they may well go out and use it the next day. And we're talking about these other organizations that it's taking them months and years to figure out how to allocate or do something with the money, which is, one of my arguments for it. It's better to have these sort of just direct stimuluses to people. Again, I'm not crazy about the redistributionist aspect of it.
See, that's the thing I most dislike about this. I'm going to be getting that one of those $1,400 checks, and that's going to go into savings. It's not going to spending. Whereas if that's a good point. But go ahead. Yeah. Whereas if they had extended or if they had increased unemployment insurance more, this for $300 to $400, they could have gone to say $500 as opposed to for a bunch more people, as opposed to giving the money to me because I'm in a pretty okay position. All of that money would have been spent right away. And that would have much more of a stimulative effect, much more of an effect of helping somebody who really needs the help, as well as, if you want to give out checks, okay, fine. But I think that, the $75,000 is too high of a cap, and maybe you do it, based on overall family size or something. But and that's, I'm with one of the. There were two Democrats who voted against this, and one of them who voted against this voted against for exactly that reason. And I think that's a really good point.
So I think you may raise a good point on that. So many people are putting this in the savings. And I think that's fascinating because actually the data that I've seen bears that out.
Yeah.
There's actually been a spike in household income along a lot of people, and there's been a spike in savings. In some respects, that's good, helping people build up if they're not using it, some sort of safety net funding. But again, that that goes to the point of, is this really necessary for a stimulus or not? And again, I'm happy to see money go back to people as sort of a tax cut, essentially, and they can do with it what they will. Some people will save it, some people will spend it. But if the argument is we need this money because it has to be used as a stimulus, I'm not necessarily buying that rationale. I guess I'm saying I'm not disagreeing with the policy, but the salesmanship they're using to sell it, I think is.
Yeah, I think it's for two things. I mean, there's certainly a direct stimulus part of it, but there's also a recovery part of it. And so looking at it that way, there are certainly parts, you're right, that aren't as going to provide that sort of direct stimulus, but there are parts that will. And I think probably other things that you might at least be okay with is raising the EITC, which is often, a lot of conservatives are a big fan of that. Boosting the child tax credit. Really?
The tax credit. Yeah, I'm lukewarm on it.
Yeah, well, so you want money to go back to people, but not poor people. I mean, what would you? I don't know. I always thought the EITC was a big conservative. Yeah, we should do that.
Well, I think a lot of conservatives see it as earned income tax credit as opposed to child tax credit. It is sort of a welfare expansion type thing. It is pure redistributionism. I mean, if you want to say that's good policy, bad policy, okay, but that's what it is.
Got it. Okay.
Right. I mean, it's in many cases it's giving tax refunds to people, more refunds than they pay in taxes.
Yeah.
So it's essentially
giving your money to those poor people. Bastards.
Yes. Well, I mean, I was saying it's giving, it's redistributing money from one group of people to another.
And you're against that?
Yeah, generally.
So you would vote, say, for repeal of a progressive income tax? Are you for that? Like brackets, or?
No, actually, no. I'd be. I'm more in favor of a flatter tax. I'm not crazy about a flat tax. Per se, because I think you lose some policy leverage and stuff that you can do. But I think our system right now actually discriminates against them. This is sort of way off topic and maybe something we talk about on tax day.
Sure, yeah.
But one of the biggest hurdles to growing businesses, growing jobs, more money is this laddered tax system that you have these increasing marginal tax rates. That if you flatten that, you increase your the mobility of people to go up without taking a tax hit when they start making more money.
Yeah, we'll definitely have to talk about this on tax day because you're wrong on so many counts here, and I can't even begin to get into that. But the data doesn't bear you out, and a lot of that. And I understand this is sort of like the conservative article of faith that you all genuflect before and your altars of money. But we will definitely have to get to that because I think that's. No, seriously, that's absolutely something that we can have, I think, a good discussion on. And I think your idea of doing that right around April 15th is an excellent idea. So I am going to, in fact, write a note right at this very second for us to do that because I think it's a great idea.
Talk about marginal tax rates.
Absolutely. Obviously, the next thing then is this goes to the Senate, and it seems pretty clear to me. What's going to happen here is that this will pass the Senate in a slightly different form without that minimum wage, maybe with a few things here and there to make sure that, Senators Manchin and Sinema are okay with it, basically. But I think it's going to pass the Senate in more or less a similar kind of way through reconciliation. And I was wondering if that's your take as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I would wonder if there might not be some other minimum wage piece. As we had talked about before, there's a procedure where the Senate can overrule the Senate parliamentarian, and this would sort of be a eliminating the filibuster light type thing, right? It would be eliminating the Byrd rule on this. I think the Democrats still don't have the votes for a 15. they might have the votes for an 11 or 12, as like Joe Manchin's talking about. So maybe you see something like that. Also.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to happen. But I will say, I think the whole budget reconciliation process with these weird bird rule exceptions is just really kind of a horrible way to get things done. I mean, what I think the Senate really needs to do is to reform the filibuster. It's not necessarily an end it or, keep it exactly the same. And what I'm hoping is that after what I'm betting will be almost complete Senate Republican sort of opposition to any major legislation, Manchin and Sinema can be convinced to support some kind of a reform, if not ending it, maybe something where, the minority gets X numbers of filibusters per session or something like that, or, something along those lines, because I think it's important to keep in mind the framers actually considered the idea of a supermajority to pass legislation, and they rejected that idea. I know, Jay, you're a big fan of the Federalist Papers.
I am. I love them.
I was looking at Federalist 22 a few days ago, and in Federalist 22, Alexander Hamilton kind of tackled that head on. He said, the public business must in some way or other go forward. If a pertinacious minority can control the opinion of a majority respecting the best mode of conducting it, the majority, in order that something may be done, must conform to the views of the minority, and thus the sense of the smaller number will overrule that of the greater and give a tone to the national proceedings. Hence, tedious delays, continual negotiation and intrigue, contemptible compromises of the public good. I mean,
nothing worse than a pertinacious minority.
There you go.
Screwing everything up.
And so I think I understand that there's this sort of, we do it because we've always done it that way. But, I think there's a lot of support for the idea that, hey, you elect a group of people and elections have consequences, and people should be able to act and do stuff and then bear the responsibility for that. And I think, whether that majority is a conservative majority or a liberal majority, I think they should be allowed to actually get something done.
Yeah. So, you're not wrong on the founders piece, but I think you're incomplete, because the other thing that and I think I mentioned this when we talked about this before, was Hamilton's understanding of how the Senate would operate is different than what it is now, because we changed the way senators were elected, and I think there's something to be said there. I'm not saying that negates everything that you just read, but I think we have to take it in context.
Fair point.
The founders assumed that senators would be appointed by states.
Right.
And would essentially be representing a state's interest as opposed to direct election.
Right. No, and I think it's always important to not pull, or not consider specific pieces outside of the greater context. So yeah, I mean, that's certainly our system has changed an awful lot, or in some ways, at least, especially on the Senate side, since 1789. And I don't know if you're calling, Jay. I don't hear you calling necessarily for changing direct election of senators, though. Maybe you are. I don't know.
Well, it wouldn't fly, obviously.
Yeah, that would be a big problem.
But I think that's something fundamental sometimes for people to think about.
Sure.
That in its as it was initially configured, the Constitution had this idea that states, the people essentially would be represented in the House, and states would be represented in the Senate. That the people would be indirectly represented by their state, but there's a different dynamic there.
No, and that's true. I don't know the extent to which that changes the reasoning about the problematic nature of supermajority requirements, but certainly that is a change from what we saw initially.
And I would say, regardless, the founders still saw the Senate as the body that would be, by design, less responsive to public pressures, public passions. I think, I don't know, was it?
That's not the case anymore. Yeah, that's certainly
right,
that went out the window a long time ago.
It's the saucer that will be the cooling for the hot cup of tea. That was how the Senate was viewed, was a that's why we give them longer terms. That's why they're elected indirectly.
So we can have statesmen like Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley,
Right. And no, I mean, the idea would be that, under the old way, you might not get a Ted Cruz or Josh Hawley. You might get someone who is more deliberative.
Yeah. Although if we went back to state legislature appointment of senators in some states, you probably would get exactly that these days.
That's quite possible.
Yeah. So, all right. Let's move on. Before we do, we're just going to take a quick break. And when we get back, we're going to talk about the House passing the Equality Act. Okay, so this week, the House of Representatives passed the Equality Act, which would amend the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to provide protections for LGBTQ folks in employment, education, housing, and other areas. And the vote was largely along party lines, though there were 3 Republicans who joined with all of the House's Democratic majority in supporting this legislation. Now, opponents of the bill argue that it's an attack on traditional Christian values and that it would violate the privacy rights of biological females, pose threats in bathrooms and locker rooms, and threaten the integrity of women's sports. Now, public opinion polling is pretty broadly supportive of greater LGBTQ protections. In fact, one recent poll, over 80% saying that civil rights protection should be extended in employment, accommodations, and housing. And at present, just under half of all states have some laws providing protections for LGBTQ people, but they vary considerably. And this measure would basically extend a uniform level of basic protections across the country, including to the 27 states where people can be legally denied housing because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. So, Jay, what do you think about this legislation?
I think devil's in the details, right? I think few people would say that we should discriminate against folks because of their, again, we start to wander into the weird semantics. Because, initially when this sort of idea was kicked around, the idea was it was to protect gay, lesbian people in employment, right? That you couldn't fire someone for their sexual orientation. Since then, the transgender movement has added a new wrinkle into it, and we had the Bostock decision that said, well, sex is something broader than your biological sex. So I guess I'm on the one hand, I'm pleased to see if we're going to do these sort of changes that they're done legislatively, right, as opposed to Bostock through the courts. Because look, you can agree or disagree, but everybody votes, and you get to see how they vote, and there's accountability, and there's democracy, and there's self-rule there. That said, I'm concerned about then the implications that stem from it, like you just mentioned, women's sports, bathrooms, locker room type accommodations, and I'm all for doing this legislatively as opposed to judicially, but I think there's going to be a lot of unintended consequences going forward on this. Particularly in the women's sports areas. I think what I'm saying is, I guess you could have had a much narrower bill to say, listen, we want to protect people from being fired for their gender identity, and define that sort of narrowly.
And I want to say I agree with you in a sense on that, because there's an old saying: do you want change or do you want an issue? And I think your argument would be that, well, Democrats or liberals want an issue that they can run on as opposed to actual change. And I'll say that we can get to this in a minute, but your unintended consequences issue aside, if it meant the difference between nationwide protections in housing and employment for LGBTQ folks or nothing, I would be okay with carving out exemptions that would allow states, for instance, to have biological-based standards for sports participation, use of public bathrooms, locker room facilities. I don't think that's necessary. The reason I don't is because this isn't some radical new experiment. There are 21 states who have laws about this, and we haven't seen the destruction of the republic or any kind of awful things happening. But like I said, that aside, if it's a question between having a world in which I don't care where you live, you cannot be discriminated against in like your work or or housing because of your gender identity, sexual orientation, or what we have now. Hey, I'll take half a loaf rather than none. And I feel the same way about faith-based objections. If evangelicals, if it's necessary to get this passed, to have evangelical churches say keeping biological males from using women's bathrooms in their facilities, or continuing their traditional teachings about sexuality and all that, or discriminating against LGBTQ people in hiring for faith-based reasons, I don't think that's right, but I'll take what I can get essentially here.
Yeah, and I, as you often say to me, look, if all progressives thought the same as you, then maybe we wouldn't have these issues. But I think it's not unrealistic to say that there are groups out there who are going to use this to seek out to try to punish folks they don't like evangelical churches, right? There will be lawsuits brought against religious groups who say, "Listen, we do not believe in transgender equity, or we believe that this offends our religious sensibilities, and no, thank you." And I think again, I think you could have a reasonable carve out. But you don't, and I think you're going to see a lot of litigation stemming from this that's going to be hurtful to a lot of organizations going forward. And I think it's going to be, again, the women's sports issue is one that is not going to go away, and I think this does hurt women in the long. Well, let me throw out an example. I represent a client that has they're a public charity that runs homeless shelters. They have one shelter that is designated for women only. Typically, the women, and it's the only women-only shelter in Cleveland. Typically, the women go there, are fleeing abusive situations. Many of them have been abused by men. There is not an unreasonable fear that women who are, very concerned about physical abuse by men would be forced to be sharing the same bathroom, shower accommodations with biological men. And I think that's a concern, right? And
I get that, but I guess maybe I'm underestimating the percentage of people, the percentage of biological men who identify as female. It seems to me that's not a very big percentage.
No, I don't think it's a big percentage at all. But I think you're underestimating the percentage of progressives who would sue on this issue just to have the issue.
I guess what I'm saying is that in a real world situation, sort of with the women's sports thing, I've heard people saying, well, men will just pretend they're women so they can win in sports. And I thought, to me, that's such a ludicrous argument, because the incredible amount of stress and difficulty and public just admonition that people have to go through when they are courageous enough to admit that the gender they identify with is not their biological gender. The idea that that any significant number of people would do that so they could, win a sporting event. I just think that's that just blows my mind.
Well, you wouldn't think that if you were a same-sex couple getting married and you could get a cake made by anybody you wanted to, virtually except this one guy who didn't want to make you a cake, that you would then demand that he make you a cake and sick the state government on them for not doing so.
No,
but yet that happens, and that will continue to happen. I mean, that was sort of that to me that, landmark cakes, that was a tremendous thing of, look, the couple who wanted the cake could have gotten one anywhere. But yet they were going to insist that this one person who didn't want to make them a cake.
But I mean, isn't that like saying that, like, well, you can rent an apartment almost anywhere, and just because you can't get this particular apartment because the owner doesn't like the fact that you're a cross-dresser, that, you can just get another apartment. Maybe that cake shop is just the one you want to go to because it's more convenient, or maybe that apartment complex just is a little bit closer to your work. I don't,
Yeah, but look, living in the real world, we both know that no, it's a setup for a lawsuit. I mean, that was the reason.
But I'm okay with that
because look, I'm not that there are certain progressives who are not okay with, hey, great, you have this right. It's everyone has to celebrate that right along with you.
You don't have to celebrate it; just you have to make my cake. If I'm just a general public person who walks in and says, "Make me a cake,"
I think they would have made them. They would have made them a birthday cake. They would have made them an I don't know if anniversary cake. That's an interesting question. They would have made them a retirement cake, but they wouldn't make them a wedding cake.
Yeah.
And nope, you got to make me a wedding cake.
Yep, that's it. Absolutely. I mean, I don't see it as any different as saying that, if a black and white couple walked in and said, "No, sorry, interracial cakes, can't do it." I don't see it as being any different.
Oh, I think there's a world of difference, because I think, first of all, I don't know that there's anywhere out there. I mean, I suppose I shouldn't say anywhere, but any sort of good faith religious objection to interracial marriage.
Okay, that
in this day and age, right? And I think you can still. That would be difficult to say, look, in good conscience, according to my faith, I can't do this.
Okay, yeah, fair. Yeah, oh, yeah, you're right. That's a fair point. I guess it could be a thing where if it's religious intermarriage, there could be good faith religious objections to that. But yeah, no, that's okay. Just like I think it would be a violation to refuse service to anyone of gender or sexual orientation that you didn't agree with, right? Like, if a gay man comes in and says, "Hi, I'd like to buy a dozen cupcakes," and you say no because you're gay, well, that's a different situation than make me a cake celebrating my wedding. No, that you're right. Those are different situations. Yeah, I see your point, and I agree with that. Yeah. So
but that's what I'm saying is my fear is there are people out there who are going to pick this up as a weapon because that's what they see it as, right? And there will be suits against places like women-only homeless shelters saying, we demand that you allow biological men in.
Sure, and you're saying that if the legislation were more narrowly tailored, that wouldn't be an issue.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I agree with you. And that's why I think that, unfortunately, I think what's going to happen is that it won't be changed sufficiently to allow it to pass in the Senate. And honestly, I don't know that any changes would be enough to get 10 Republicans in the Senate to vote for it. I see this issue as being too toxic for Republicans to vote for, even if it were very, very narrowly tailored. But I don't think that's going to happen.
I think you're probably right. And regardless, I don't think it sells in West Virginia. So
yeah, well, there's that too. There's that too. All right, let's move on to our next story, and that is something I never thought we'd talk about, but a controversy over the Office of Management and Budget Director. I mean, go figure, right? But it's normally something that's pretty low key, but that changed when President Biden nominated Neera Tanden to the position, because Tanden is the president of the liberal think tank Center for American Progress. She's been involved in national politics for decades now, and this isn't about her basic qualifications for the position. It's not really in question, but
it never is.
No, well, this one isn't. But what Senate Republicans and at least one Democrat, that's Joe Manchin again, they're objecting to are her many social media comments that disparaged conservatives and Bernie Sanders as well. And prior to her nomination, prior to this being made public, Tanden deleted over 1,000 of her tweets, and something she admitted to in her confirmation hearings. Now, some people on the left argue that racism and sexism may be at least part of the reason for this response from conservatives and Tanden's of Indian heritage, and that Republicans are saying that her tweets disqualify her were often all too willing to discount or even ignore entirely the tweets of President Trump. So, Jay, let's say you're in the Senate. Do you vote to confirm Tanden or not?
No, but first let me just touch on this is racism, sexism.
Sure.
At what point in our society will we finally get over this absolute nonsense?
Mm-hmm.
You're saying that the racist Republican Senate, which voted to confirm Ben Carson, which years ago voted to confirm Condoleezza Rice, which I'm trying to think other notable cabinet or Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas, is somehow when there's a question on a Democratic nominee, it's racist and sexist. And I think that's some of the kind of rhetoric that really poisons what goes forward. That every time there's, look, if you want to say it's because of these tweets, okay. But the reflexive racism, sexism business, I think, is it just doesn't.
Let me respond to that before we go further, because I think I certainly would agree to you to the extent that it's not the end all be all only issue. But I also, I would disagree with the fact that it's necessarily not an issue at all, just because in the past the Senate has confirmed people of color and has confirmed women to positions. My take on this is a little more, I guess you could call it nuanced, in that it can play a role. I've seen plenty of instances where even though women and people of color may be approved for things, the standards, at least even semi-consciously or unconsciously, are a little bit different. I mean, and I see this as something as prosaic as student evaluations of myself and my wife. And the things that students say to my wife, who were both university professors, they would never think of saying to me. And honestly, I think I know she's a better teacher than I am, but some of the things, because she's a woman, I think, in part. And so I'm not saying it's the only thing, but on some level, I absolutely do believe that a lot of people have this unconscious, if you don't want to call it bias, certainly an unconscious, I don't know what you'd call it, a small bias. I think that absolutely exists. I've seen it. I see it every day.
But do you think that, again, the idea that
I don't think that it's the thing, but I certainly think it can play a role. I think it can be a factor at the margins, and maybe it's a factor here. I don't know. For me, I actually think it's more about. To me, the big thing is the tweets argument and the idea.
No, absolutely, and to me, that's why the sexism, racism thing strikes me as so false.
Yeah,
right?
I think I certainly think it's a mind thing. Now, to me,
because I think you could very much say, "Hey, we got issues on the merits here."
Well, here's the thing. To me, it's not so much the tweets; it's the fact that before her nomination was made public, she deleted over 1,000 of them.
Right.
Because
1,000's a lot of tweets.
Because it seems to me that if you don't think that these tweets are problematic, if you can make the argument, and I think you can. That, as the head of a liberal advocacy group think tank, this is the sort of, stuff that I did, and I'm not shying away from it, but deleting them says this was somehow wrong. And so I don't think you can have it both ways. I think you can make an argument there's nothing wrong with doing that in that position, but that's not the same. That's not what I would do as director of OMB. But I don't think you can delete all those tweets and say, there was nothing wrong. I mean, you see what I'm saying? That's my problem.
No, I agree with you 100% on that. Yeah.
I mean, if she hadn't deleted those tweets, it would have been a no-brainer for me about how I'd vote on that. But that actually gives me a certain amount of pause, I guess.
Yeah.
But I should also, so you wouldn't, I mean, do you really think that mean tweets should disqualify someone?
Yeah, I think they can. Yeah.
See,
it depends.
Because my view, and I said this when Donald Trump was president, my view is that the president basically should get to pick his or her own people unless they are clearly unqualified, and sure, Joe Biden could have picked someone less controversial, but also I think, it's pretty clear that Biden is working very hard to make his nominees the most diverse group ever. And so far, that's actually been the case. It's a more diverse group than under Trump, certainly. And it's even a considerably more diverse group than under the Obama administration. And at the same time, it's a more experienced group measured in terms of prior government experience than either the Trump or the Obama administrations. And clearly, Joe Biden is trying to send a message here. And I think he's succeeding, though it is giving him some problems.
Well, isn't that a little insulting, though, to say, look, this is the only woman or minority I could find is this one who has this, big tweeting past, right? And I'm sure there are hundreds, if not thousands, of other qualified women and or minorities who could do that job just as well. Well, and I do think in this case that the tweets do go to the qualifications to some extent. Mm-hmm. Because part of the job is going to be working with Congress, more so than, say, some other, cabinet member. Right. Right. I mean, Department of Management Budget, that's what you're doing is budget, and it's necessarily working extensively with Congress. So if you have tweeted and alienated a whole lot of folks on both sides of the aisle, that necessarily sort of compromises your ability to do the job. So I would say it's, I wouldn't say the tweets are always relevant, but certainly, public statements are relevant, and public statements about people you'd be working with are relevant. I mean, much like Marjorie Taylor Greene said that, she thought that Pelosi, her future coworker, ought to be, tried for treason.
Shot in the head.
It's just not a good way to start on the new job.
Yeah, no, and I think you're right about that. It certainly is a consideration. Weighing everything, including her qualifications, so forth. I would, because my default is to, unless there's a clear disqualifying thing, to give the president, allow the president the right to pick his or her people. And so I would have. I'd like to think that I would have had that position if it had been a Republican president, someone who, from a conservative think tank, who tweeted mean things about Democrats, So that's kind of where I stand on that. But right. My sense is that she's not going to be confirmed, and I guess that's probably your sense as well, right?
That's my sense too. Well, and then there also, look, if we're looking also just in the real world hardball politics of this, there is always a sense, typically in any presidency, of the Senate wants to assert itself, whether even it's a partisan thing or even just an institutional thing. And they typically, I don't want to use the phrase I was going to use, but you make a stand somewhere just to remind them, hey, you still need our consent, right? And this is maybe the one.
Yeah. I think you're right. We're going to take one more quick break, and even though we're running a little long, there's a story that Jay really wanted to talk about, and the more I dug into it, the more I thought Jay's right on this, and that is the House hearings this week on fake news, or the Attack Fox News hearings, depending on how you want to look at it, I suppose. And we will get to that right after this final short break. Okay, so Jay, a story that you brought to my attention is hearings this week, on Wednesday, in fact, the House Energy and Commerce Committee had a hearing that they called Fanning the Flames, Disinformation and Extremism in the Media. And Democrats on the committee cited the January 6th insurrection as the main reason for the hearing, and throughout the hearing, they criticized conservative media outlets for their role in promulgating false information and dangerous conspiracy theories. As well, 2 Democrats on the committee sent letters to a bunch of carriers, including Comcast and AT&T, asking them a number of questions, including what moral or ethical principles they use when deciding to carry certain channels, and whether or not they plan to continue carrying Fox News, Newsmax, OANN, and if so, why? And you've got a pretty big problem with this, right, Jay?
I do. I think this is very much an attempt to chill speech that the government, as it's currently constituted, is opposed to. I think the thought experiment is how would the media have reacted if Donald Trump had said, "Look, there's a whole lot of fake news going on around there. I want to have," had a proxy in Congress issue letters saying, we'd like the folks who carry CNN or MSNBC to show up and explain why they're allowing these crazy conspiracy theorists to keep coming on and saying I'm a Russian spy, giving them airtime. Should some of these shows put on people like, Trump arch nemesis Rosie O'Donnell, who was a 9/11 truther, right? And it was an inside job. I want Congress to look into this. I think the response would have been, "Oh my God, this is the beginnings of authoritarianism and censorship and all that." And to some extent, I think they'd have been right. I have a big problem with this because it's again the making the government the monitor of what's true and what's not true is incredibly problematic, and it's really antithetical to any sort of a free press. Just the idea of a ministry of truth, I think, is a real problem, and this seems to be where it's headed. I guess the other thing I would point out is pretty much any reporting that is unflattering to the government or certain political actors, when it's first reported, it will be described as misinformation or disinformation. And if you can shut companies down by pressuring the platforms that support them, I think that's a tremendous problem. So,
I guess I would make a distinction between the hearings and the letters. And I don't know if you would make a distinction there. Do you think that the hearings were out of line as well?
I think the letters were more out of line.
Okay, that's what I was getting at. Yeah, I read the letters. There was someone posted a copy of them somewhere, and I read the letters, and I can see where they're more problematic. But I also believe that these are members on a committee that have jurisdiction over this sort of thing. And they were requesting information about the standards that outlets use when deciding on what content to carry. And given that broadcast media is subject to regulation, has been since there's been broadcast media, that doesn't seem to me to be outside of their potential legislative duties. And so, I guess I can see where this could potentially be a problem, but to me, it's not a problem unless there's actual legislation being considered. So if they want to request information about that, I don't have a problem with that. I'm curious about that. I want to know what standards they use, and I want to know their justification for carrying certain things. I think that's pretty useful to know. Now, that doesn't mean that I would be in favor of legislation that would say you cannot carry certain outlets. I would be up in arms against that sort of thing. But the letters as they stand, no, that's some interesting stuff. I want to know that too.
Well, it doesn't it though get into sort of a nice platform you have here. Shame if somebody started regulating it. Isn't there sort of a threat beneath that?
Oh, I hope so. Yeah, absolutely. I think.
Well, isn't that a problem of the government?
No, I don't think so. Because I think
there's. What's the difference between saying, "I am going to deny you your free speech," or if you say that, I'm coming for you?
I think the difference is, government, there's always the implicit threat of regulation of anything. And you're right, if it becomes more...
But there shouldn't be when it comes to speech. That's why we have a First Amendment. Well, that's why we have what's called the chilling effect, right?
We have a First Amendment, but the First Amendment does not cover lies and disinformation designed to...
Yes, it does. Absolutely it does.
Well, then, if it does, then libel and slander, I guess, are okay under the First Amendment.
No. Well, they are. But you have
not.
a civil. You have a civil remedy in libel and slander. And what it turns on is the damage that is done to a particular person, and they have a right to be vindicated in court if those statements are in fact false. But it doesn't give the government a right to simply say we have a general police power to determine what's true and what's not true.
I see what you're saying. So then you feel that there can be no content regulations of broadcast media at all?
No, of course not. I mean, there's all sorts of health and moral type stuff regulation, right? I mean, that's in broadcast. Now, again, broadcast is a little different than cable, but no. I mean, what I'm troubled by is the idea of the government saying, "Look, we'll determine what's correct information and what's misinformation."
No, and I see,
and you better not get on the wrong side of that line.
And that's why I think there's an important distinction between asking for information on this and passing. I would have a hard time envisioning any sort of legislation that wouldn't, that deals with this, that wouldn't set up government truth commissions, and that would just, I would totally not be okay with that. But I also think that it's important to call organizations to account when you and I and everyone know, or just about everyone who's being halfway reasonable about this, know that these organizations were in fact spreading things that they knew to be untrue because it was good for ratings. And you can talk and
lots and that's plenty of media companies, outlets do that.
Yeah, and just the idea to say that, well, you know what, I'm gonna sit back and allow democracy, or the trust in democracy, to be destroyed, and just hope that enough people like Dominion Voting Systems bring lawsuits who have deep pockets who can afford to do that. That I think is, that's ridiculous. I'm not going to do that. And so I think while regulation might be impossible in any way that would preserve the First Amendment, and it would be struck down by the courts anyway, I certainly think applying some pressure, that's perfectly okay in my book.
Yeah, and to me, that's exactly the problem. Is the right. Look, if we can apply the pressure and get the same result, then we can avoid the First Amendment.
Yeah, I see your point.
We can still get the chilling effect that we want. But we can avoid the First Amendment.
Yeah, I see your point. And I guess I agree to an extent, but I feel like this only happens when, or only should happen, only does happen, when it's just the lies that are promulgated are just so egregious and go so to the core of democracy, like we saw in 2020, that's an entirely different thing. And so, therefore, if that kind of speech is chilled, I'm okay with that.
Well, I mean, what about sort of the the MSNBC type folks who would bring on your Rosie O'Donnell's, your real, Trump is a Russian agent folks. On
that, I have to say there was a recent report from an ex-KGB agent who claims that Donald Trump actually, the book, I guess, that came out, that Donald Trump actually has been, if not an actual Russian asset, was cultivated by handlers and was a very easy target because he is both vain and not very intelligent, according to him. So, not that that's going anywhere, but yeah, no, I see.
No, but okay, so here, but that is what you just said. That is sort of exactly my point that I would like, that I want to make is
sure.
What you just said, right? I don't know if that's true or not.
Yeah, I don't know either.
You don't know if it's true or not.
The KGB agent may not even know if it's true or not. I don't know. Yeah, I haven't read the book.
Yet, how would you feel if you and I were called before Congress, which in some respects might be kind of cool?
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
But to answer for it, listen, you're making representations on your podcast show that about things that go to the core of democracy, but they may or may not be true. Right,
I would be.
You could be spreading. You could be spreading Russian disinformation right here. You're a stooge for Putin.
Yep, I hear you.
Right. I mean, that's the problem is once you get the government into that, then what happens next time is you decide, well, you know what, I better not say that because I don't want to get called before Congress again and be accused of being a stooge for Putin.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a good point. But I also think there's a difference between the example that you just used and when a major news organization has buckets of credible evidence that things are one way and argues repeatedly, brings on person after person after a person saying things that organization knows to be false. And that's a different situation. Maybe you think that's too fine of a distinction and one that can't be made by government. And I might be inclined to agree with you about that.
Yeah, no, I do. And I think the remedy is if Fox has somebody crazy, then let CNN or MSNBC have someone else and say, hey, that guy's nuts.
See, to me, that's just a recipe.
Here's the proof that this is wrong.
See, to me, that would work in a world where people were watching both, CNBC or MSNBC and Fox, but that's not the world we live in. And so we end up with partisans on both ends who just get fed a load of just, in many cases, lies. And so I don't think that that's really a remedy that works because things just keep on getting worse.
Okay. Well, we will continue to watch because I don't think this is going away.
No, I definitely agree.
And
with
the other thing I wanted to point out, and we're kind of backtracking a little bit on the letters, the information that was requested, a lot of it was really digging a little deep, and I mean, to me, it struck me as some of it's probably proprietary, right? I mean, as I was asking about contracts but there were questions about how many viewers did you have and when did you have them? And, essentially who was watching? I mean, and that really sort of troubles me a little bit that do you want Congress inquiring into your cable provider as to who's watching when? Now, again, they're not saying, Mike was watching on this day, but still it's aggregate numbers. And that's still, to me, I find more than a little troubling that the government is going to be digging in onto who's watching what TV shows when.
All right. Well, before we go, Jay, every week I was saying to Jay before the show starts is that we typically end with recommendations, but we haven't in a while, and that's on me because I just keep on forgetting about that segment. But I do want to end this week with a recommendation segment finally, once again, after a not so brief hiatus. And Jay, I thought maybe we'd start off with you.
So my recommendation, and I I'm not on Twitter. I don't follow Twitter, but this this was something that was linked in something else I read. But there is a Twitter account, and it is COVID last year, or words to that effect. And what they do is they sort of report the pages of the reporting of the COVID virus as it was reported last year. And I'll just say it's eye-opening. It is refreshing, and it gives you a good sense of look, what really happened and who'd said what during the time that this was happening and evolving. And to me, as a conservative, it's a really good reason why we ought to always be skeptical of experts. So.
Okay, yeah, There's a whole other conversation there about skepticism of experts, but I will not get into that.
No. And we can have it. And my point would be, and I think your point, not to jump all over it, but
no, go ahead.
You would say, look, they were using the best information that they had at the time, and that turned out to be wrong.
I feel like pointing out that sometimes we should be skeptical of experts in this environment is sort of like saying during the middle of the Great Flood saying, hey, a little bit of water is good for the plants. It's like, but anyway, whole our point. My recommendation this week is actually a documentary series called Connected, A Search for Unity. It's put together by a guy named Monty Moran, who's the former CEO of Chipotle. And I was actually able to preview the first 2 episodes. It's really some interesting stuff. And if you want to check it out, you can just go to Monty's website. It's loveisfree.com, which might sound like a weird URL for a website, but it's from the title of his book, Love is Free, Guac is Extra, Chipotle, that sort of thing. So, and you can watch a trailer for it and just find out when it's airing in your area. And I thought that was really pretty interesting, and I felt it was well worth my time, and I wanted to pass that along. All right, so that's it for this episode. But as soon as we are done, we're going to be recording our bonus episode for supporters. And on that episode, we're going to be talking about the Supreme Court deciding not to hear a case on the Pennsylvania election challenge and Justice Thomas's dissent, which I actually have a lot of sympathy for. We'll get into that. We'll get into President Biden's executive order on supply chain review and concerns among not having pharmaceuticals and computer chips and all that. Donald Trump's financial records finally in the hands of the Manhattan District Attorney, what that means, and maybe more. We'll see how it goes. But all that will be there for supporters on Wednesday morning. It comes out every Wednesday morning. And also, as a Patreon supporter, you get that. And again, ad-free versions of all our shows. To check that out, patreon.com/politicsguys. And if you ever want to get in touch with us, you probably know how to do that, I hope. mail@politicsguys.com. We're also on Facebook and Twitter. And you'll find links in our show notes. We have special thanks to our executive producers, Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Andra Masker, Daniel Toe, Chris Wilkerson, and Nathan Sosnowski. We'll be back with a new show next week. We hope you'll join us.